We will wait a second to let people come in.
How many people do we expect?
Not sure.
Okay.
Normally the liberal breakfasts are quite well watched.
We have 1 hour, yeah?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, because we have parliamentary session, so.
we won't keep you for too long, no worries.
Sorry, but.
So Daniela just told me we have 82 registrations for today.
Oh, that's okay.
And then of course we also have the live stream. Always helps us reach out a bit. Okay, shall we? I'll just start. Good morning, everybody, and welcome in the name of the ALDE Party and the Friedrich Naumann Foundation to today's Liberal Breakfast. My name is Jana Weber. I'm in charge of the human rights activities of the foundation here in Brussels, and I will be your host for the morning. Today we'll be talking about populism in Europe. Populism has been or become a bit of a buzzword, especially as well in the public discourse over the last decade or so, and Europe not least because of the several crises that we have lived and that the European Union and its member states had to manage. We're talking financial, migration, now health crisis, in addition to the national challenges that we're facing in each and every member state. So how do we handle this, especially from a liberal perspective, is going to be today's topic that we're seeking to explore. And we're going to kick this off with a bit of research that the data analyst Matej Ruška from the ALDE Party is going to present to you now. Matej, take the floor.
Thank you, Jana. Let me share my screen first. Here we go. Great. I hope everyone can see that clearly. So thank you again. My name is Matej Ruška. I'm an ALDE Party data analyst. Thank you for the opportunity to very briefly present some of the results of our survey we did. Very briefly about the survey, just to have an idea of what we did and how we did that. This is the second big survey we did this year. The goal of the party, of the Secretariat, is to have 2 waves each year leading up to the EP elections. So we can have another round of results next spring and then next autumn as well. We had a sample of, so we covered 27 countries in Europe, 24 EU member states plus 3 additional countries. We had a sample of around 1,000 people in each country, which means that in the next slides, you will see any difference between 2 countries. If that's bigger than 4 percentage points, you can think of that difference as sort of meaningful, right? 4 percentage points plus minus is sort of sorry, the rule of thumb here. The data are still very fresh. We finished the collection at the end of October and sort of spent the November getting them, putting them together. And this is the really the first look we are having across the EU countries and comparing them. So if you have something in particular that you are interested in, please do reach out after the presentations to us. Okay, so when we are sort of talking about populism, right, the standard definition says that populism is a political approach that appeals to quote unquote ordinary people who feel that their concerns are disregarded by the established elites or institutions, and there are some certain political entities that can exploit this feeling. And to a degree, this is more of a rhetorical strategy, and you can have various ideologies and policies attached to this sort of populist rhetoric. as we all very well know from Europe and the US, you can have left-wing populists, you can have right-wing populists, you can have centrist populists. But the core the core feeling that institutions abandoned quote unquote common people, we measured that in our survey using this pair question, where we asked respondents to select one of the two opposites in the question, whether they feel that established institutions have failed to deliver for the common people, or whether their point of view is closer to the option that our established institutions continue to provide for the common people, right? And this core feeling that the institutions abandoned the common people is, as you can see, largely shared in sort of Central Eastern Balkans part of the EU, with all V4 countries above average, and Slovakia being, with 77% selecting that institutions failed the common people, sort of being a leader in this question. Especially for the Slovak context, me as coming from Slovakia, this can also be maybe to a certain degree explained that one of our presently ruling parties has sort of the common people in its name, the party name. So this can do some stuff in the results. But anyway, the shared feeling that sort of institutions and elites are failing what common people think, how their lives look like, are more present or prevalent in the sort of not only V4, but the eastern part of the EU as well. And when we look at the bottom part of this chart, you can see Denmark, Finland, Norway, Switzerland, Netherlands, the usual suspects when we sort of think in general of countries that are not maybe that susceptible to populist rhetorics. A feeling of non-representation by the elites and institutions can also be related to a general feeling shared across the state of the country, right? And as we all know, we are again in the middle of another wave of COVID pandemic, and this certainly influences how people feel about the situation in their country. And again, this can be used and exploited by populist movements. These negative feelings that people have, they are sort of fed up, anxious about the whole COVID situations, lockdowns, measures, and so on. When we collected the data, it was again during the October when the situation wasn't that bad in most of the European countries. But as you can see, on average, 64% of people in Europe used negative words to describe how they feel about the situation in their country. And Slovakia, from the V4 countries, here being the lowest, with 83% of people describing situation in their country using negative emotions. And I sort of had a brief look at what the newest research about populism attitudes is. And these sort of emotions are a really strong predictor of populist attitudes, right? So you have various factors that can be causing populist attitudes, and so you have socioeconomic reasons, you can have sort of policy views, but a new research is sort of highlighting that how people feel, the emotions they have, is one or can be one of the strong predictors of populist attitudes as an outcome, right? So again, this whole pandemic we are having again now isn't very favorable to non-populist movements or parties. And let me close my brief introduction with two more slides. We also had a couple of questions. We have like very extensive questionnaire, but also a couple of questions about that were related to explicit political strategies that can be used by various populist movements, or are being used by various populist movements across Europe and the US, trying to exploit this general distrust or this general sort of dissatisfaction with how the countries look like. The first question is whether respondents think that elections are free and fair in general, or whether they think that there is a significant fraud in elections, right? And as you can see, fortunately, on average, 59% of our European respondents said that they think that elections are free and fair. But going to the very bottom of the chart, you can see Hungary with only 36% believing that elections are free and fair, and Poland being below average, and Slovakia being below average as well, Czech Republic being slightly above average, sort of average-ish. But again, 59% with Hungary at 36%, that is quite worrying, and that can be a political strategy used by some movements in the country to sort of exploit the situation. And let me close my intro with a chart that I was a bit shocked when I saw these results. Here we asked respondents whether they think that the media is generally unbiased and trustworthy. That's the pink color here, or whether they think that the media is generally biased and has an agenda, which is the blue one here. And as you can see, on average, only 33% across Europe think that the media is unbiased, with Czech Republic having 17%, Hungary 18%, Slovakia 22%, and I've lost track of Poland. Yeah, Poland at 28%, right? And this again is sort of what you are seeing on the social media and various communication platforms that various populist movements use and populist politicians use, and try to exploit this feeling that, you know, media as part of the established institutions aren't really telling you what's truly happening and aren't representing your opinions, and you shouldn't really trust them because, you know, we are those who can tell you the truth. I have a couple of more slides. If there will be something that I hear during our discussion, and I know we have that covered in the data, I will try to sort of interfere, but this is sort of a general introduction to how, from our data, how these sort of populist attitudes look like across Europe now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matej. This was a very interesting presentation. I think it helped us get on track and in the mood for today's discussion. I've heard you just told that you're gonna stay on the panel. It would be lovely if there's anything that you could contribute in terms of statistics or insights whenever it comes up, maybe also when it comes up through the questions. I've been told to tell everybody to please ask the questions in the Q&A section when you have some. We very much welcome them, and we'll try to address as many as possible. But first of all, you might have already spotted them on your screen. I'm going to introduce our panelists for the day. We first of all have Annelou van Egmond, ALDE Party Vice President and former D66 campaign manager. And we also have with us Adam Szłapka, Nowoczesna party leader and member of the Polish Parliament. Welcome. I would give you both the floor now, not at the same time, obviously. Maybe Annelou will take the floor first for some introductory statements, and then we'll follow up with a couple more specific questions. Annelou, please.
Yeah, thank you. Yes. I was pleased to get the invite actually to participate in this debate, because it gave me a reason to really think and ponder about this, like what should be the liberal answer to populism. That's basically what I focused on in preparation of all this, because I think that's a very relevant and I personally feel also very urgent question. We have to be careful not to claim the moral high ground, but I do feel that it is up to us liberals to find this answer. And it is a difficult debate, if you even can call it a debate. But if you are in a debate with populists, it always feels uncomfortable. One instantly feels that their notion of segregation between the insiders, the ones who are in the know, and they themselves, and the outsiders is wrong. And the critique on any democratically validated or constitution-based authority is undermining. We know that. And the need to see conspiracy and ill will everywhere feeds suspicion and distrust. The promotion of violence and lawlessness to overrule the so-called elite in order to install the will of the real people is a direct threat to the rule of law and democracy. And for the first time in decades, we have seen that also within the European Union, right-wing populist parties, we haven't seen left-wing populist party doing it yet, but right-wing populist parties can stir up enough discomfort and anger to obtain through the democratic process itself the means to then demolish or start demolishing that very process as well and the rule of law. And this in itself should be enough to mobilize any liberal thinking individual or party. But I fear so far we have not spoken up loud enough. And our reluctance to enter into this discussion comes not only from discomfort, it also comes from disbelief. And if one wants to hold liberals accountable for one thing in this relatively new divide, it should be our optimism, although naivety might even be a better word. We have long held on to the idea that democracy, once achieved, results in a stable equilibrium where people can participate in decision-making at regular intervals, thus expressing their views and influencing the direction of the administration of their community. And so we would happily live ever after. Sadly, that's not true. A lesson that we'd better learn sooner than later is that democracy, in fact, is fragile and needs protecting and reinvigorating all the time. Now, for those of you who need more convincing, I would recommend reading Democracy Rules by Jan Werner Müller, but that's just if you want to, investigate this more. There's another pressing reason why we liberals have an obligation, I feel, to speak up. And this is the abuse of the idea of liberty the populists promote. They do that now in the context of the COVID debate. Whenever, due to the threat of this disease, there are restrictions to limit the spread of the virus, it is only reasonable to have a political debate. We could ask, are these the right measures at the right time? Are there alternatives that might have the same or even a better result? Do the expected benefits of the proposed approach justify an infringement of this scale? These are all fair questions and have nothing to do with populism. This is a normal political debate, and the authorities should be able to answer these questions again and again and again, every time they come up with new rules and regulations. Populists, however, seem to have hijacked this discussion. And first of all, they mostly deny the threat of the virus, or they expect their own immune system to cope with it. They state that the virus has been designed especially to then have vaccines that are at least unsafe, if not meant to get some sort of control over the recipients. And many of them also doubt or deny the legitimacy of the authorities in the first place. And so they claim the freedom or the liberty, they use that word, as an individual act to not obey the rules. So the no distancing, no face mask, no vaccine, and it's all considered a completely unacceptable limitation of liberty as they frame it. This claim of individual freedom to the detriment of the freedom and safety of others has nothing to do with the concept of liberty. That is the fundament of our liberalism. So the way I see it, there are two reasons we liberals must speak up against populism: to defend democracy and to defend liberty. And these are not two separate issues. If we defend our liberty and create more liberty for all, we will also secure the basis of democracy, because the populist call will be a lot less tempting. And we have seen in the numbers that Matthijs just shows us that the call is in fact tempting. And this is really, this is something we need to address urgently. Now we saw the numbers that Matthijs showed us, but I would like to still think about these numbers, because who are we up against? There seems to be this notion of rising populism in Europe or even elsewhere. And we also have this idea that it has something to do with COVID. I'm not really sure that that is true. Scientific research, and there has been data research over the last 50 years in Europe of the sentiment of the people, show that in fact there is quite a steady support for non-democratic or authoritarian or nationalistic and other parties that promote discriminating policy of about 15%. Now that, of course, as far as I'm concerned, is 15% too much, but that is about sort of the stable group of people that you could maybe say are hardcore supporters of this idea. But besides this hardcore support, there are middle ground voters who can be tempted to, as they sort of say it, just for once, vote for a more extreme solution in order to voice a strong discontent about the handling of something or a present social or political crisis. And I think what we should think about is that maybe the populist movement as such hasn't grown more bigger, but they have just grown louder and more mainstream. Now, why have they raised their voice in the last decade? And my guess is this is partly because the creation of chaos and disruption has proven to be a very successful marketing tool. They have all seen Donald Trump obviously do it. He's the ultimate model. And some of the media, and I'm not one to media bash in general, but some of the media have been a willing accomplice to this. But I also think that they are speaking up louder because there's a belief on their side that, I'm sorry, I can't put it in front of the door. Yeah. Sorry, someone tries to bring something to my house. It is that they think that this is how you persuade this middle ground group to join their ranks and they are sort of, they see a relationship with the pandemic because a lack of control and fear for one's livelihood or even your life is a perfect feeding ground for the scaremongers. The uncertainty that comes from the effect of the pandemic are a serious threat to many people, and this should not be ignored or underestimated. And this is probably where we liberals have a lesson to learn. But when we address this fear, we should not be doing it just to stop the populists, even if that is the result. We should be doing it because it underpins our idea of liberty. For those who know their classics, we're talking about the difference between negative liberty and positive liberty. I'll show you a book that everyone should read. This is Isaiah Berlin's great book, 4 Essays on Liberty. And if you haven't read it, I highly recommend you do so, especially the chapter that's called 2 Concepts of Liberty. Now, I'm doing the author a great injustice here, but to break down, the basics are: negative freedom is the fact that no one is interfering with your choices. That's it. Positive freedom is, in fact, not just the option of making your own choice, but also the presence of basic guarantees to make these choices possible. Now, populists are using the concept of freedom of liberty in the most minimal or negative form imaginable. I, as an individual, have the right to do whatever I need to do for reasons obvious to me, and I do not have to take into account what this means to other individuals or indeed the collective. If my rights are limited, that is a gross injustice and it legitimizes my taking to the street or even worse. That's what populists say. Liberals use or should be using the concept of liberty in a much more positive, inclusive way. There is no point in being free to buy a house anywhere you want when there are no houses. There's no point in being able to choose whatever career suits your interests and talents when there are no jobs, or only temporary ones with no benefits. There is little point in trying to live a carbon-free life when all the industries around you can go on burning fuel without limitations. And this, I'm sure of it, is the real underlying reasons of many of the insecurities and fears that people feel around COVID. If you are hanging on for dear life, just making ends meet, living in an apartment that's too small for you and your family, with poor schools in the neighborhood and no public parks to go play or exercise, and overcrowded public transport that take you into a job with no prospects or job security, it is no wonder that saving democracy is at the back of your mind. And if there's one thing you don't need on top of all that, it's a pandemic. Now, nobody wants or needs a pandemic, but we must be mindful of the fact that for some it's an inconvenience. Like, you can't go skiing in Austria. And for some, it's a real threat. And this is what the populists feed on. They have no structural solutions for any of the real issues we face in our society, except for just excluding large groups of people from using facilities or even entering the country, with the promise that when it's just us, there'll be plenty to go around and we don't need to fear. I'm nearly there. Now, this is not true, but the simplicity of this message is very tempting. What should our answer be? We liberals, what should we say to this? First of all, the admission that even though many of us literally live in the best part of the world, this is not true for all of us. And also that there is a great need to address issues that trouble a larger part of our community with a public answer. And that's not what we liberals usually go for in the first place. But when we think about education, employment, housing, healthcare, sustainability, a public answer can easily include a public-private cooperation or a free market solution. I'm not promoting socialism here. I mean, let's be careful. But I do think that we need sort of a public set of rules that are applicable to everybody in the same way. And this doesn't call for an even smaller government, as many liberal parties in Europe have been promoting, but it calls for an ever better government that safeguards an inclusive and responsive democracy. And for this, we liberals have to be the advocates of a democratic infrastructure that is resilient, with better access to the political process, through early voting, for instance, more transparency regarding party finances, because there's a lot of suspicion going on, as Matthij just illustrated. And if you need inspiration for this, I would highly recommend you look at the coalition agreement that was published in Germany last week. That is the basis of a new coalition of the Social Democrats, the Greens, and the Liberal that actually is based on this principle, on this idea. Now, maybe the biggest challenge, but one I'd be willing to investigate, is the admission to the people that, and therefore the voters, that we liberals, or we the elite, do not have all the answers. And I know this sounds scary, with the populists tooting their one-size-fits-all solutions. But if we are aiming for an inclusive and responsive democracy, we need to try and find answers to real issues that people face, but we also need to be prepared to share our dilemmas. People understand that many of the modern day issues are not easily solved, and the pandemic is the perfect proof of that. What they don't understand is governments, and I'm saying this, including governments with liberal leaders or coalition partners, including one in my own country, that pretend they are in control, only to find out time after time that, oops, they are not. Because that is the real gift that we give to populists. And stopping that is the beginning of the answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your introduction. I especially appreciate also that you pointed out that we're not necessarily talking about a rise in populism, but that there has been a steady support over the time, because that's something that's very inflationary used in the public media. I would like to give over to Adam now, for his welcoming remarks.
Once again, good morning. I try to be very, very briefly, because to left some space for discussion, and I try to be more practical, because we have our 6 years dealing with populism, and we perfectly know how they challenges whole democratic system and how it can destroy the democratic system. The populists have several measures they are using. First is creating fears and giving very simple answer for that. We know it from history, and they use the fears and use the distrust Maciej mentioned in his presentation. and also taking hopes of people and giving some magic solution, very irresponsible all the times. But all these measures are very just useful for them to taking the power, and taking the power by them is very, very challenging and destroying for democracy. In case of Poland, you may know that Poland were one of the most successful democratic transition used to be. Now everything has changed. Poland is now not, we cannot call Poland a liberal democracy right now. It's something election democracy. After this 6 years of governing by populists, and according to the presentation, free and fair elections you mentioned in this presentation, election can be free, but at the same time can be not fair. And the Poland is the best case for showing that, and I can explain it later in the discussion. In case of Poland, populists from the Peace Party attacks the founds of democratic system and the judiciary, rule of law, free media, local government, all the foundation of the democratic system and constitution. Human rights, especially women's rights, minority rights, LGBT rights, everything has changed during this 6 years. That's why we cannot call the Poland liberal democracy anymore now. Hope in the future we are going to change that. But it's also a very big threat for future of Europe. Although the Poles are the most Euro-enthusiastic society, I think all over the Europe, 90% of Poles supporting European integration, they trying to generating fears against Europe and just planted the seed anti-European agenda in Poland. So it in some future it can change society support for European Union. How we should deal with this introduction, few words, how we should work and deal with populism, I think in two ways. First, it's short term, and the second long term. Dealing with populism, short term, it's of course according to the countries where populists are in the power. So it's showing their lies, their propaganda, manipulation, and showing that they have no positive agenda. They have no positive any ideas to rule anything. And long term, it's first of all is education. With good education, populists in every single country with good education, populists are weaker. And the second, making the independent institutions stronger in every country and all over the world. There should be in liberal democracy free independent institution, and what we should do with them to make them stronger, and on the constitutional make them more independent. And the second thing, it's to make the civil society and civil society institutions stronger. It's the best vaccinate against populism, I think. And when we are talking about long term dealing with populism, education, institution, and civil society.
Thank you very much. Yes, indeed, Poland has been a country that has been accompanying us in this discussion, especially on the EU level as well. So all eyes on Poland very often, unfortunately. But we wish you all the strength in changing some things. And now we'd like to just follow up with a couple of questions. Both of you have delved into many aspects already. So we're just going to elaborate a bit on a couple of them and give you chances to elaborate in them. One thing that has been interesting over the last couple of years, especially now with the COVID-19 pandemic, is that populism has become much of a buzzword. We've said it earlier, but also there has been the perception that populism has changed a bit in the public perception, and how it has been employed over the pandemic, when it has become much more apparent, especially from the political side. Do you see any change in populism over the last years, maybe in your countries, maybe on the European level? And what is your analysis to that? Who would like to start? Maybe Annelou, so we'll go.
Well, one of the things I think we see, and there is some scientific research into that, is that it becomes more mainstream. At least when I speak about the Netherlands and the UK that I know best, their populism always used to be like a niche, like a political niche. I mean, it existed and everybody knew about it, but it was such a small quantity that one could easily ignore it or even make fun of it. I also live in France part of the year, actually, and there you've obviously had right-wing extremism on a much larger scale for a longer time. But it didn't have that populism. I think now we have a mix of right-wing extremism and populism, whereas earlier that used to exist separately from one another. Not ignoring that there's also sort of left-wing populism, but at least in Europe, it's mostly right-wing populism. Although the populist idea of the real people and their sort of needs that should be met sort of makes for what we call like a sausage shape. We used to think that politics was like a linear affair where you had left-wing and right-wing parties and parties in between. Nowadays, you almost see that it's a sausage where the extreme right and the extreme left sort of meet one another in this toxic mix of populism. But one of the things I see, at least in my country, is that there is still a relatively small number of extreme right-wing parties, but there is a number of parties that are sort of clouding around it, that they're not afraid to associate themselves with it, and they are using the same rhetoric as populist parties because they think that it's effective or that it will get them more voters. And I personally think that's a more dangerous thing when mainstream parties are trying to sort of nudge up to that populist idea and populist rhetoric in order to get the vote. I would always strongly recommend that first you have your principles and then you find the voters to go with it, and not you go and see where the voters are and then see if you can have them join you. That has nothing to do with leadership.
Adam, would you like to add?
my turn. I think populism doesn't change in general. Because fear, well, they're using fear, enemies, crisis, and very easy answer from people hope and to make more power. It's all the time, all the same. Now we have time in Europe, in all over the world, where we have more crises because of COVID, because of, for example, situation with Polish, Belarusian borders, and every crisis they generating more fear, more enemies, showing the separate groups to show, look, they're enemies. We need to protect you from them. We have to fight for our sovereignty, and this is just propaganda. But it's all these measures, all these fears, all these enemies using everything is just used for by them for making more power to introduce new rights against human rights, to just like that. So I think the populist hasn't changed the last years. The core is the same, but they are using everything to have more power and to fighting with human rights, rule of law, and liberal democracy, because it's all these things stopping taking more power. That's as easy as that.
Yeah, maybe also in addition, I think one of the changes that you have in the rhetoric with populists is that if we talk about the political, as let me say, sort of the normal political debate, there are different political parties, say the Social Democrats, the Conservatives, the Liberals, and sure enough, we all have different ideas of what in the end we want to do with society, but we are willing to compromise. We are willing to look for a solution where nobody gets 100% of what they want, but we will find sort of a middle ground where everybody can sort of live with the outcome. However, the populists make every debate into a sort of a zero-sum game, like as in we want 100% of what we want, and anybody who doesn't agree with us is not just someone with another political opinion. No, some people who don't agree with us are our enemies. And the only way we can save our country is by making sure that we get 100% of what we want. And we have to not only win the elections, we have to completely demolish the other side, because they are a danger to who we are. And that's a complete shift in how we look at politics.
Maybe to follow up on this also, like from your personal experience, Annelou, in the Netherlands, there are 2 liberal parties, which we're very happy about, but also 2 right-wing populist parties in parliament.
Much more than 2.
Yes. How have liberal parties been navigating this?
Well, there's a difference here between the two liberal parties. The VVD, which is the more conservative liberal party in the Netherlands, has in fact been in a government with one of the more right-wing parties, which is the PVV. The D66 has always refused to do that and refuses that until this very day. We will never ever join a government that also has a right-wing, extreme right-wing or populist party in it. But we have a long-standing sort of right-wing extremist, actually more, not so much a populist, but an anti-Muslim party in the Netherlands, which is the PVV. But nowadays we have a number of smaller, as in sometimes only 1 seat in the parliament, smaller, more populist right-wing extremist parties, the most extreme of them being the Forum for Democracy, which is a completely alt-right, it's even, even in the United States, the GOP would frown at what the Forum for Democracy brings into debate. What you see more and more is that these populist parties, although they have a seat in parliament, they don't actually look at parliament as a place for political debate. They only see it as a spot where they can sort of shoot their videos in order to their followers how they feel, and to sort of expose all the other politicians in the Netherlands as being completely irresponsible, and to the extent that they actually promote physical violence. Many politicians in the Netherlands nowadays need protection, which, I mean, this is a country where the king rides a bike to get his own shopping at the supermarket. This is the Netherlands. And over the last 1.5, 2 years, you see that more and more people, just because they are a member of parliament, need to be protected by the police because of this discourse that's used by the populist parties. It's quite alarming, I have to say.
Indeed. Maybe to just give it back to Adam, we saw a couple of weeks ago, The Guardian conducted research on populist sentiment across Europe and the populist index. And surprisingly, they saw that in Poland, the populist sentiment or support was falling. Like they said, in some of the questions from 80 to 65%, which is still a whole lot. Like, don't get me wrong, but there is some negative trend that we are seeing for Poland. How do you agree with this development from like an everyday political perspective in the parliament as well? Or do you think it's just a societal development where there's a disconnect with what's happening on the political level and what's happening on society? How do you interpret this?
I think the populist sentiment in Poland is falling because people see that our government party, the first, don't have any positive agenda, cannot deal with this crisis. The COVID crisis in Poland, it's higher now than in Europe, in other countries of Europe, because they are afraid of anti-vacciners. They are blackmailed by them, and that's why many people are dying in Poland. Many people are ill now because of COVID. That's the first thing. They are, of course, using the border crisis to make themselves stronger, because it's the best thing for them. It's another crisis. We are preventing you from these migrants. They want to invade Poland, but still they are not dealing with that very good. And people see that. People see the manipulation. People see lying. People see what they are doing in public media. By the way, the propaganda in Polish public media is much more worse that it used to be during communist time. You even cannot imagine, because most of you don't remember communist time in Poland, and this time of propaganda on not democratic country. But now they are best. That's like Russia today, the Polish government media, and people are tired of that. But what's interesting, according to this presentation Maciej mentioned on the beginning, Poles are not very trustful to the institution, as you said, but the Poles trust European institution more than Polish institution now. And Polish pro-European sentiment is very, very big. And still, because they are trying to, our populist piece are trying to do many things against Europe, so they became weaker, because Poles are very, very enthusiastic, European enthusiastic. I think Poles are just tired of this government. They are also in crisis. They have very, very thin majority in parliament. We can see that they are in conflict. We can see that they are very corrupted. They are trying to steal public money all the time. And that's why I think there is the hope in the future that they will lost an election. But still, when I mentioned on the beginning that the election can be free and at the same time cannot be fair, this is the case of Poland. Polish elections are free. That's no doubts. You can put your vote and it's free count, but still they are using public media, public propaganda to support one party and one candidate. When we are talking about the president election, they are using all government administration to support ruling party. They spending public money to campaign. So this media are free. This election are free when we are talking about the process, but not fair when we are talking about campaign. So it's not about distrust and what there are people thinking about that, but it's just true, free and not fair. That's the Polish case now. That's why I'm saying that Poland, it's not liberal democracy anymore. It's electing democracy, because there are free election, but there's no rule of law. There are not free media, and so on and so forth. But there's a hope. Everything is changing in Poland, and we can see that they are getting weaker. And what we should do, it's because we have not normal democratic game in Poland, like in other European countries. That's why we need to work together with all opposition parties, somehow like in Hungary. It's also hope for us, and do everything to stop populists. And after that, we can have normal democratic game and in Poland, and get back on the path of liberal democracy.
Well, you can count on our support for sure.
It's good to end on a high note. You for sure have the support of your base. I saw in the Q&A function Karolina from the ALDE individual members in Poland mentioning, don't you think we as liberals need new good stories to tell people, not anti-populist, but our own liberal good stories? And I think that very much falls in line as well.
But they shouldn't just be stories. I mean, we shouldn't just be talking about this. We should be acting. And as Adam has already mentioned, we need to do education. I mean, obviously, I'm from the education party, so what do you expect? The answer to anything is education, 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 but also all the other topics that are really important to people nowadays. I mean, I personally feel that most people are not intrinsically anti-government or anti-democratic, but they just need their personal problems fixed first before they want to start saving the world. And we have to be much more oblivious to that. And there's nothing wrong with a good storyline, but it has to be backed up with actual actions. People need to see an improvement. If a country or a county or indeed a town has an administration where liberals are an important factor, that should make a difference. That should make a difference in people's everyday life, and that's what we're there for.
Greatly said. Apart from you two who have been answering lots of great questions, I also have a question for Matej that he answered in the Q&A function, but I'm afraid only the person who asked it can read your answer. Mm-hmm. So I'll read it out again for everybody. Thanks for the introductory remarks, Matej. First, have you run any regression analysis, especially on the first question? And second, also traditional media has some sort of agenda setting, say more conservative or leftish. Do you think that also contributed to the results you find on media being very biased?
Yeah, I thought it should be visible to anyone, but thanks for pointing that out. So the modeling is in the pipeline. So that's what we want to do, to have a better understanding what are the determinants of populist sort of attitudes, right? So whether it's more the strong influence of the emotions or socioeconomic background or political views or policy preferences or whatever. So that's what we're gonna do in the next couple of weeks. And with the media, I really do believe that media legitimately can have this sort of gatekeeper agenda setting function, right? That's what they are. That's what they do. But the general distrust, I really don't think, and untrustworthiness can't be really explained by people's understanding of the role of the media in a society, right? And this can be sort of connected to the situation in Poland, what Adam mentioned, that people can sort of legitimately understand that, for example, public media are not really free and fair, right? And they can be untrustworthy, but the general sense of distrust towards media is something that we need to maybe look at in more detail in next waves. But if I can steal a minute and just show one more graph. We also asked about 3 main issues that participants think are most important for the government to address immediately. And this goes back to what Annelou was mentioning about the sort of what the governments and what liberal supporters think that is the most important policy issue that should be or could be a priority of liberal parties, right? And this, I think, would be sort of good news for education fans. I hope you can see that. There was a list of issues. I think it's 20 issues, and each respondent was able to choose 3 of them. So 13% in this case means that 13% of respondents selected this as one of the top 3 issues that the government should address immediately. And this is across Europe. ALDE supporters mean voters or fans of ALDE member parties, right? So pink bar is ALDE supporters, and gray one is the overall population in Europe. And as you can see, the healthcare, which is sort of understandable in the times of COVID and sort of healthcare collapsing in various countries. Jobs and unemployment, which is sort of I think we generally see in these surveys that issue that most people are still struggling to a certain degree are sort of working conditions and whether they can find a good job. Climate change, which is sort of surprising to a certain degree, but it is again having still more and more prominent role as a policy priority and policy issue across Europe. Pensions, welfare, migration, education, right? So those are sort of the top, and you can see the rest down there. But healthcare as a top priority, and those we call them like kitchen table issues, so jobs, pensions. But climate change, as a surprise, at least for me, migration to a certain degree still, but those issues that liberal parties are very often associated with, like democracy, Europe as a topic, or sort of gender issues, LGBTQI policies, are really not on the agenda. And that doesn't mean that they are not important for liberal parties and they shouldn't be sort of pushed, but people don't see them as priority, and not even very often ALDE supporters, as something that the government should address right now, today. So that's just a data point from my side. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think this was a bit of a positive point towards the end of the discussion as well. I hope at least. Looking at the time, I just want to ask you a concluding question that you have or may have answered already in your various statements today, but just to have it all on one table is, how do we deal with populist parties? What is the magical answer? Is there one? Probably not. But what has proven effective so far? It's probably also very related to which country we're operating in and what environment, but maybe you can give us some insights. Maybe
what I said is, I think we need to fight. I don't like the word fight, actually, because I don't want to fall into the frame of populists that everything is a military operation. But we need to address populism if and where we can, but not just in rhetoric, but by actions. And we should defend democracy. As Adam has pointed out, that has to be by making institutions stronger, by making the whole process more transparent. Education, always a solution, because ignorance obviously is a feeding ground for populists. And we have to be aware that this is not a fight that can be dealt with in a couple of months or even a couple of years. I think for the decades to come, this is going to be one of the major divides in society, and it is up to us to speak up, to address it, to work on it, and to constantly point out to people that simple solutions don't exist. And if you run after people who claim that they have the answer, you're going to be fooled. And if you join us, you can be part of problem solving that's going to take a long time, but at least it's going to take into account the the interests of all of us.
I hope that the process we have now in Poland is some kind of vaccination against populism. That's very, very difficult and very painful, maybe, but I hope that it will last for many years in the future when we get it. I think three things long term, because just now in Poland, just we have to fight with this populism in the election. But in the future, long term, education, making an institution strong and independent, and making the civil society strong and independent in minds and well educated. That's three, I think, universal for every single society measures how to deal with populism.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Before we close, I'd once again like to thank all the panelists today, and also like to highlight to the audience to please stay tuned for the research that is released by ALDE, but also we have a study by FNF on how to deal with right-wing parties in Europe, drawn on the experience of parties in Austria, Estonia, Finland, the Netherlands, and Sweden, that I invite you to check out. So once again, thank you, everybody. Thank you also to the audience for joining us this early before work, and have a great day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.